Info. We're discussing big and significant issues in politics, as well as every other thing that affects the development in the country. We have idea segment first with IOB. We're looking at the questions on international observers' reports on the 2019 general elections. European Union, most notably, has released a report together with the IRI and NDI. You can follow the program and ask the questions you want on our different handles at Public Square NG, at Rotimi Sankore, at Ideas Radio NG, at Ninjama, at our Obo, at Nigeria Info FM. You can also send your questions to our WhatsApp number, which is 0809 597 5805. We'll let you also know the numbers, when to call during the course of the program. Welcome, Ayo.
Hello.
Always a pleasure. And people have been waiting to me, ask, when is Public Square coming up? I said, but it's coming up, just hang in there. Rotimi, good evening.
Good evening.
Well, we're in the Public Square, so,
Yeah,
it's a good place to be. And the Ideas segment is really happy to be in the Public Square.
Right. Okay, so Rotimi, we go over the EU report and then we...
Yes, so the EU Election Observation Mission to the 2019 elections has issued their final reports, and unless you have just arrived from another planet, you will know that the APC and PDP have been trading words about what it means. We won't be going through the entire report. We'll be looking at the 30 recommendations, and first of all, with Ayobe on the ideas segment, we'll be looking at the recommendations that relate to integrity, democracy, ethics, and accountability. That is ideas. So Ayo, who has also had great experience as an observer as international observer in many other countries, can also bring that to bear. Yes, home and abroad. In Nigeria, were you an observer?
Well, yes,
Weren't you a monitor in Nigeria?
I was a monitor when I was monitoring the conduct of the police during elections, but I was an observer when I was working with the National Democratic Institute.
In other countries?
In Nigeria, because I headed their elections program.
Yes, of course.
So I observed the 2007 elections.
So you have been both an observer and monitor in Nigeria.
Yes.
And then an observer, an international observer in other countries.
In other countries, from Indonesia to Kenya. So it's been interesting. But I think that what's been interesting about the EU observation report has been the reaction of the parties, which perhaps you're going to get into when we get into the Public Square proper. But from an ideas perspective, I think that one thing that strikes me the first thing that, and I have to say that I haven't read the report, I haven't had access to the report yet, but if I look at the recommendations, it starts off by saying the systemic failings evident in this election and the low levels of voter participation show the need for fundamental reform. And I think I want to unpackage that immediately, because I think that the low levels of voter participation are probably not a reflection of the elections, the systemic failings in the administration of the election. We've had elections that have been much worse than this, and the level of voter participation has been higher. So I would perhaps say that the low level of participation is more a reflection of the disappointment or disillusionment of voters who perhaps felt that once you have democracy, every other good thing comes with it. But if we look at the actual recommendations, you notice, as you said, that there are 30 recommendations, but of those they made 7, what do I call them, priority recommendations. And I think that if we are looking for integrity in our elections, definitely the legal framework has to be established now, because you remember that when the president was presented with a version of the Electoral Act that he could at last agree with, he then declined to enact it into law because he said it's too close to the elections. So I think that we are now, we have now enough space between now and the next general elections to be able to have this legislation enacted into law, and it will possibly clear some of the problems. And what the EU is also saying is, let's have it all in one place. Don't let's be doing, the Electoral Act 2010 as amended by the Electoral Act Amendment Act of 2019 or whatever. Let's have a consolidated piece of legislation which then repeals the 2010 Act and makes the 2019 or whatever act it is going to be the one that we refer to, that covers everything. But then I think, Rotimi, you would also see that there are some things that we ourselves have continued to point out in the ideas segment of the program about the need for transparency, that if an election is going to be taken as having integrity, then transparency is a primary need. And that's one of the things that we have discussed in the program. I'm not going to say much about organizational and operational capacity within INEC, because those are obvious. Those are actually some of the things that led to the logistic failings, which by themselves are bound to affect the integrity of an election. Again, the issue of consultation with stakeholders. I've had calls before to say that I'm disturbed at the slow response of INEC to many issues, that because it's not just a matter of is the election a credible election, but is the election seen to be a credible election? Which seems a bit of a circular statement. But if somebody says that this glaring inefficiency is going to happen in your election, and you as the electoral body know that it's not, but you keep quiet about in the face of that assertion, then that assertion now becomes the narrative. And it's one of the things, again, that makes people say, well, there's no point in turning out to vote because we now know that X, Y, Z is going to happen. And then by the time you, the election management body, come out to say, oh, no, that's not what's, that's not true, then people say, well, I mean, where were you when it was being said? So I think that consultation with stakeholders, more frequent meetings with political parties and so on and so forth. Of course, we need to talk about not just training of ad hoc polling staff, but that training is not just, I mean, INEC talks about the training in the use of smart card readers, closing and counting procedures and so on. But I think also that there has to be some level of integrity training. We remember that when we were discussing the elections, there was a case where people were being asked, do you want the just the presidential election, or do you also want to vote in the National Assembly elections? Now, that should not have happened in any case, because what it meant was that somebody who had been accredited and therefore would be a genuine voter would actually end up giving up their right to vote in election. Whether they wanted to vote or not, they had the right to spoil the ballot paper if they liked. But by leaving it in the hands of the election, the polling officer, of course, as I said, you can see the problem about that, if there's no integrity in the polling offices.
In terms of smart card reader, the EU Observer Mission Recommendation 8 says that the smart card reader data from polling units should be made public, including number of voters accredited, verified, and that this should be announced and recorded on result forms, and this should be on the INEC website, so that there is clear transparency. Why do you think they've made this specific recommendation?
Well, because when you have the result announced at the polling station, then if the result announced does not include the number of people who have been accredited, that's
and verified.
Well,
Verified and accredited, yes.
Then it means that you are leaving a gap, which could become a real credibility gap, about what happened to the number of people who were accredited but somehow didn't vote. Now, INEC's procedure of having it all as one continuous process, accreditation, and then you go and vote immediately rather than coming back after accreditation, ought to have reduced that gap. But I guess that the EU's observer mission found that it didn't necessarily reduce that gap. And then, of course, we have been saying I'm tired of repeating it, that INEC needs to make it possible for anybody to check what happened at their polling station on their own website. And this is not just a matter of whether the results can be transmitted electronically. Even if it is carried by a carrier pigeon or by hand and foot, it is still something that I should be able to go to my to the INEC website and see what is there. That's what transparency is all about.
I mean, many countries have done this. You go on the electoral body website, you search or you click by region, and there are continuous drop-down buttons until you get to your
own polling station.
Yes, which says X number accredited, X number voted, X number spoiled, so and this is the final. And everybody says, okay, we were there when it was counted, and we are happy. Which is why the EU Observer Mission then says in recommendation 9, which they described as a priority recommendation, that in fact
it should be a legal requirement.
Yes. And that those results forms should also be scanned and published on the INEC website, which has been done in countries like Kenya.
Well, and I think we also need to be clear that, because there's been this controversy about INEC server, and we've all seen the INEC chair explaining that the network coverage is not equal across the country. But this is not, even if the results, if the results come by hand, however they get to the collation
you
center,
have to input them at some point.
Exactly, and that's the point. So why isn't it being done? And I think that's
you're not inputting them onto your tablets. They are going on a computer which has a server.
Well, I think that's a separate matter, to be frank. But what I'm saying is that if you get them to a point, and they are going to be put onto, even if it's you carrying it to Abuja by hand, at some point it gets to INEC, and we ought to be able to see it.
But why the server controversy? I mean,
I don't know, because, as I said, the expression server is being used to mean so many things. And since the matter is before the court, I'm one of those who has said that I would rather that the court determine, is this a server? Does it, because people use the expression server.
The server?
No. I think that because, and I must say that when I said that, I'm happy to let the courts determine it. I was immediately pilloried on social media. Is this the IO, and so on and so forth. And I say yes, it is me, because mine is that when these controversies are live, then they're in court. I think that's where it should be determined. I don't know what your own solution is, where the matter is in court and one party is saying there's no server and the other party is saying there is. Because, as I said, to me there are different things that are different expressions that are being used for it. But I also want to still getting back to the INEC, to the EU report, is that a lot of these recommendations really do hover and center around this issue of transparency. Make what is available. So, and we've also discussed in this program about the e-server that INEC has, or not the e-server, there am I using the word server, the e-collation center. They have a center, and you remember that Clement Wankwo of the Situation Room had been pressing that even if it's a matter of people going in and being there incommunicado so that they can't get out and send a message, go and shore up your vote in such and such a place, that they should be able to observe it. And I think if that had been done...
During what you are talking about, during the South African elections, we were watching it, gigantic billboard, inside the coalition center. As it comes in...
Collation.
The number collation. The numbers appear under every heading.
Yeah. We see it in so many sessions. So I think that transparency and openness to observation within its own headquarters will go a lot of the way toward. But as I said, because INEC was doing so much of a blinkered, of course we're doing the right thing. Why are people doubting us? And not really understanding the need to reach out and make people not just accept your word that you are doing the right thing, but also to come in and see that you are doing the right thing. Last thing I would want to say is that before we close, I'm calling this is the next last thing. Let me put it like that. I'll keep going till I'm made to stop. But I think another important factor is recommendation 15 is political party oversight needs to become strengthened. Now it's either that INEC is overseeing political parties in the way that they run their business and have their primaries and select their candidates, or it's not. If it's not, fair enough, but it can't be that they only wake up when there's a dispute within a political party, and that's when they know that things did not go, because what it means is that all kinds of mago and wuru can go on, as long as they're able in the end to stifle any complaint or criticism, then it can be allowed to go without comment. So what can I say? The EU report, I guess you will go into it later, but I think that if we're looking for integrity in our elections, because one of the points that comes out of the report is that if the integrity of the elections is low, if the turnout is low, then the sense of accountability also falls in those who have been elected. We've already talked about the way that the president is now coming out and making promises that he did not commit himself to when he was running for election. These are some of the things. And then if we now say, but you promised this on Democracy Day, well, that wasn't part of my election, and so on. So I think that there's, of course, the ethics of the people who are operating a system. It can't be overemphasized, but without all of those coming together, I don't think we can have an election that meets the ideas requirements. And I think that for our next election, that is the least that Nigerians should expect. And of course, we have elections coming up, gubernatorial elections, off-cycle. Then I think the next one is in Bayelsa State. We want to see that INEC is taking some of these issues on board and is letting people really observe the election in its entirety, in full transparency.
INEC has said that they will look at the recommendations.
Of course.
And it's worth mentioning that one of the key recommendations from a previous election observer mission was that accreditation and voting should be simultaneous, and that people shouldn't have to go home and come back after 3 hours. I just flagged that so people who are listening are wondering, these people and their recommendations, what exactly are these things about? It does have a positive effect sometimes. Oh,
I think every election, every improvement that we've seen in our elections is because people have observed and made recommendations. Some INEC has seen itself, some outsiders have seen, some Nigerians have seen. But it's a process that we need to improve. And I would say that in some regards, strangely enough, our elections have more integrity than some elections that we've seen in more developed democracies. But for now, Rotimi, I have to close the ideas segment. I want to thank all of those who have been listening to Ideas. Remember to check us out on our website, follow us on Twitter. Aro has already given you the details, but I'm sure that if you go to the public square, you'll also find us poking our nose in there. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you again.
All right, so we'll take a quick break. We come back, continue discussion on public